Behind the Silence, the brutal reality of Rikers' shocking prison documentary. The silence after the screams. The hallway smelled of sweat, bleach, and something darker, blood. A guard's radio crackled with static as the echo of a scream faded into silence. Inside a cell, a young man lay slumped against the wall, his face swollen and his eyes shut completely. His name was Marcus, just 19 years old, locked inside Rikers Island. The most chilling part? The entire unit went silent. No one spoke. No one dared to say who hit him or why. At Rikers, silence isn't just a rule, it's survival. And behind that silence lies a brutal truth that outsiders rarely see. But how did Marcus, a teenager who hadn't even been convicted yet, end up in this nightmare? And why does the silence of hundreds of inmates allow this violence to keep happening? That's what we're about to uncover. The arrival. Marcus had been arrested for something small, stealing sneakers from a store. He couldn't afford bail, so the judge sent him to Rikers to wait for his case. His mother cried in the courtroom, begging for mercy, but the system didn't care. The moment Marcus stepped off the transport bus, he felt it. The air at Rikers was heavy, filled with tension. Guards shouted orders like drill sergeants. Inmates watched from behind bars, their eyes sharp, some filled with hunger, others with rage. The first week was confusing. Marcus learned quickly that survival here wasn't about strength alone, it was about silence. If you saw a fight, you didn't talk. If a guard beat someone, you didn't look. And if someone whispered your name, you pretended not to hear it. But one night, everything changed. The lights flickered. The steel doors clanged shut. From the far end of the tier, a loud crash erupted, metal against bone. Marcus froze in his cell, heart pounding. He could hear muffled grunts, fists connecting, bodies slamming against the concrete. Then, a voice cried out, a sharp, desperate scream. Moments later, silence. The silence was worse than the scream. It meant no one would help. It meant whatever just happened was done, and Marcus had to live with the fear of knowing it could be him next. And that night, Marcus realized Rikers wasn't just a jail. It was a world where silence protected the brutal and punished the weak. The first lesson. The next morning, Marcus kept replaying the sound of that scream in his mind. He wanted to ask the others what happened, but when he glanced around the unit, all he saw were blank faces. Men sat quietly at the metal tables, eating the same gray oatmeal and stale bread, eyes locked on the ground. Nobody mentioned the night before. Not a single word. That's when Marcus learned his first real lesson. At Rikers, silence is the only shield you have. Talking could get you jumped, stabbed, or worse. But just as Marcus thought he could blend in, he made a mistake. Later that week, during recreation, he whispered to another inmate, asking what had happened in the cell block that night. He didn't even finish the sentence before the inmate leaned in close and hissed, "Shut your mouth if you want to stay alive." The warning wasn't enough. Word traveled fast. That same night, Marcus's door slid open during a routine cell check. A group of older inmates walked in, their faces hard, their eyes cold. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The beating came quick, fists slamming into his ribs, a knee driving into his chest, a punch cracking against his jaw. Marcus gasped for air, tasting blood, his body curling up on the concrete floor. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The men walked out silently, leaving him broken and trembling. The guards? They didn't even look his way. The cameras? Either they didn't work, or they weren't being watched. The silence of Rikers had swallowed Marcus whole. But what Marcus didn't know was that this was only the beginning. In Rikers, every beating is a message, and his message had just been sent. The calm before the next storm. 4 days after the beating, Marcus kept his head down. His ribs ached every time he breathed, and his jaw throbbed when he chewed. He didn't ask questions anymore. He ate his meals in silence, staring at the tray of mush they called food, trying to make himself invisible. In the yard, he noticed how different groups ruled different corners. The gangs were obvious. Latin kings in one section, Bloods in another, smaller cliques scattered around like chess pieces. Marcus didn't belong to any of them, which made him a target. Still, there were moments that felt almost normal. An older inmate showed him how to wrap toilet paper around his toothbrush to make a makeshift brace for his ribs. Another slid him an extra packet of Kool-Aid at Chow. These little gestures gave Marcus the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could survive. But Rikers has a way of crushing hope. One afternoon, as the inmates lined up for dinner, a fight erupted in the Chow hall. It started with a shout, then a tray flew through the air, smacking against the wall. Suddenly, fists were flying, chairs screeched across the floor, and the room exploded into chaos. Guards rushed in swinging batons, shoving men to the ground, pinning them with knees to their backs. Marcus ducked under a table, heart racing, as the noise of violence echoed all around him. From where he crouched, he saw a guard slam a prisoner's head against the metal food counter, blood spilling onto the floor. Another inmate screamed as he was dragged across the tiles, his face leaving a red trail. And then, it happened again. Silence. The chaos ended as quickly as it began. The guards barked orders, the injured were dragged away, and the Chow hall fell quiet. Inmates sat back down, picking at their food as if nothing had happened. Marcus sat frozen, his hands trembling, realizing the truth. At Rikers, violence wasn't an exception. It was the rhythm of life. And the silence that followed? That silence was the most brutal part of all. The weight of silence. That night, back in his cell, Marcus couldn't shake the images of the Chow hall. The sound of fists hitting flesh, the blood dripping down the counter, the look in the guard's eyes as he slammed that inmate's head, it all replayed in his mind. He wanted to ask questions, to talk about what he saw, but the silence around him was deafening. The older inmates sat at their tables in the day room, playing cards as if nothing had happened. Some laughed. Some stared into space. But nobody mentioned the fight. Nobody ever did. Marcus realized this was the unspoken law of Rikers. Speak about the violence, and you become part of it. For a few days, things seemed calmer. Marcus kept to himself, moving carefully, following the silent rules. He thought maybe, if he kept quiet and avoided attention, he could fade into the background. But Rikers doesn't let anyone disappear. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the unit buzzed with restless energy, an alarm blared. The steel doors slammed shut, trapping everyone inside their tears. Guards sprinted down the hallway, radios crackling with urgent shouts. Marcus pressed his face against the bars, trying to see what was happening. Then he heard it, a roar from down the tier. Shouts. The unmistakable sound of fists pounding flesh. The thud of bodies crashing against metal. This time, it wasn't a quick beating. It was a storm. Two gangs had clashed, turning the tier into a war zone. Men swung makeshift weapons, sharpened plastic, broken broom handles, even socks filled with batteries. Blood splattered against the walls as guards fought to gain control. From his cell, Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. He could see the chaos just a few doors away. He could smell the sweat and fear in the air. And when it was over, when the last man was dragged away bleeding, when the guards locked everything down, silence fell again. But this silence felt different. It was heavier, thicker, like the whole building was holding its breath. Marcus knew what it meant. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something even worse. Drawn into the game. After the gang riot, the unit stayed locked down for 2 full days. Meals were shoved through the slot in the steel doors. Cold sandwiches, spoiled milk, sometimes nothing at all. The air in Marcus's cell was thick and hot, the stench of sweat mixing with mildew. For hours, he lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself he didn't belong here. He was just a teenager who made a mistake. He wasn't a gang member, wasn't a fighter, wasn't built for this place. But Rikers doesn't care who you are. It decides for you. When the doors finally opened, Marcus felt the tension in the tier like electricity in the air. Every man looked sharper, harder, angrier. The gang lines had been redrawn after the riot, and the pressure to pick a side was stronger than ever. At recreation, an older inmate approached Marcus. His arms were covered in tattoos, his stare heavy. He didn't ask, he told Marcus. You roll with us now. If you don't, you're food. Marcus's throat went dry. He didn't want to join. He didn't want to fight. But saying no wasn't an option. Silence had protected him before, but now, it trapped him. Days passed, and Marcus found himself pulled deeper. Carrying messages. Watching doors. Sitting with men he didn't know how to trust. Each step drew him further into the violent current of Rikers. Then came the test. One night, the lights flickered out across the unit. Shouts erupted. Marcus felt a hand shove a sharpened piece of plastic into his palm. His stomach dropped. "Do your part," the voice growled. Down the tier, another inmate had been targeted. The gang wanted Marcus to prove himself. He stared at the weapon, his hands shaking, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear the chaos around him. And in that moment, Marcus realized the truth. Rikers wasn't just about surviving silence anymore. It was about choosing what kind of monster the silence would force him to become. The test of blood. The sharpened plastic felt heavy in Marcus's hand, even though it weighed almost nothing. His fingers trembled as he stared at it under the dim, flickering light. Around him, the noise of the tier roared, shouts, fists pounding, the clanging of bodies against metal bars. The target was just a few cells down, a skinny inmate with a shaved head, cornered by 3 men. He was already bleeding, his back against the wall, his eyes darting in panic. Marcus's heart raced. He didn't want to do it. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't like them. But the eyes of the gang were on him. If he refused, he knew exactly what would happen. He'd be next. "Move," someone barked in his ear. Marcus stepped forward, his legs shaking so badly he thought he might collapse. The world around him slowed. He could hear the sound of his own breath, ragged and desperate. The sharpened weapon dug into his sweaty palm. He raised his hand. But before he could act, the chaos exploded. Guards stormed in, swinging batons, spraying mace that burned the air and set lungs on fire. Men dropped to the ground, coughing and screaming, as the tier filled with the sharp sting of pepper spray. In the blur, Marcus dropped the weapon. He hit the ground, choking, his eyes streaming with tears. A boot pressed down on his back, pinning him to the concrete. The guards didn't care who started it, who finished it, or who got caught in the middle. Everyone was guilty at Rikers. When it was over, Marcus was dragged back to his cell, his face red and swollen from the spray, his chest heaving with fear. He hadn't done it. He hadn't crossed that line. But in Rikers, mercy is weakness. And weakness is a death sentence. As Marcus lay on his bunk, gasping for air, he knew one thing for certain. The silence of Rikers wasn't going to protect him anymore. It was only going to bury him deeper. The price of refusal. The next morning, the unit was quiet, but it wasn't the usual silence. This one was colder. Heavier. Marcus could feel it pressing down on him as he sat on his bunk, his ribs still aching, his eyes raw from the spray. The gang hadn't said a word to him since the night before. No looks. No whispers. Nothing. And that silence was more terrifying than any threat. It meant they were planning something. At Chow, Marcus felt the stares. Men shifted aside, letting him walk alone with his tray, as if they didn't want to be near him. He sat down at the end of a table, untouched food sitting in front of him. His stomach twisted with hunger, but he couldn't eat. Every bite tasted like fear. The hours dragged. He kept his head down, tried to act invisible, but it didn't matter. Rikers has a way of finding you. That evening, just as the unit quieted down for count, it happened. His cell door slid open, though no guard had called his number. Marcus froze. 2 shadows slipped inside. Before he could react, a fist cracked against his face, splitting his lip. Another blow slammed into his stomach, folding him over. He hit the floor hard, gasping for air, blood dripping down his chin. The men didn't speak. They didn't have to. Each punch, each kick was the message: you failed. You don't belong. And now you pay. Marcus tried to shield himself, curling up on the floor, but the hits kept coming, boots crashing into his ribs, knuckles slamming into his temple. His vision blurred. His ears rang. The concrete felt cold against his skin. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. The shadows slipped back into the darkness, leaving Marcus broken and silent on the floor. The door slid shut. And just like that, the silence returned. But Marcus knew something had changed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about becoming invisible or being destroyed. And in Rikers, invisibility is almost impossible. The guard's silence. Marcus lay on his bunk for hours after the beating, every muscle screaming in pain. His face was swollen, his lips split open, his ribs throbbing with every breath. He thought about calling for help. He thought about pressing the emergency button in his cell. But he didn't. Because he already knew the truth. Nobody would come. The next morning, his suspicions were confirmed. A guard walked past his cell during rounds, his flashlight beam sliding over Marcus's bruised body. The officer paused, stared for a long moment, then simply kept walking. Not a word. Not a question. Just silence. That silence hit Marcus harder than any punch. It was the clearest message yet. Here, pain didn't matter. Here, the guards weren't protectors. They were part of the machine. Later that day, the unit was let out for showers. Marcus dragged himself slowly down the hall, his body stiff, his steps unsteady. He caught his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sinks, one eye swollen shut, purple bruises blooming across his cheek. Behind him, he heard laughter. Not from inmates, but from two correctional officers. They stood together, whispering, smirking, watching him limp by. One of them muttered under his breath, loud enough for Marcus to hear. Should have kept his mouth shut. Marcus's stomach dropped. The guards knew. Maybe they even allowed it. Maybe they opened the door for those men. That night, as he lay in the dark, Marcus understood the brutal reality. At Rikers, the silence didn't just come from the inmates. It came from the people who were supposed to keep order. The officers turned their eyes away, or worse, they let it happen. And if the guards were part of the silence, then there was truly no one left to trust. Just before sleep finally pulled at his heavy eyes, Marcus heard something that froze him in place, the sound of keys at his door. The lock clanked. The steel door creaked open. But this time, it wasn't inmates stepping inside. It was a guard. And the silence that followed was the most dangerous of all. When the guards turned, the guard stepped into Marcus's cell, his shadow stretching across the floor. Marcus sat up slowly, every nerve in his body on edge. He expected an order, maybe a threat, but the silence was worse. The officer closed the door behind him, cutting off the thin light from the tier. For a moment, the two just stared at each other in the dim glow of the hallway lamp. Then the guard spoke, his voice low and sharp. You think you're different? You think you can play both sides? Don't forget, you're in our house. Marcus's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, to explain, but his throat locked up. The guard's words weren't a warning, they were a verdict. Without another word, the officer grabbed Marcus by the collar and slammed him back against the concrete wall. The pain shot through Marcus's bruised ribs, stealing his breath. He gasped, but the guard pressed harder, pinning him in place. You talk, you cry, you run to anyone, and you'll wish it was the inmates who got to you first. The officer's eyes burned with something colder than rage. It wasn't personal. It was power. Then came the blow, a fist to Marcus's stomach, folding him over. Another to his jaw, snapping his head sideways. The beating wasn't as wild as the gang's. It was controlled, methodical, calculated. Every strike sent the same message: stay silent, or you don't survive. When it was over, the guard straightened his uniform, adjusted his belt, and walked out without looking back. The door clanged shut, leaving Marcus gasping on the floor, the taste of blood in his mouth. Outside, the unit was quiet. No one had seen. No one would say a word. And Marcus finally understood the full truth. The silence at Rikers wasn't just culture. It wasn't just fear. It was a system, enforced from both sides, guards and inmates alike. And in that system, Marcus was now trapped in the middle, with nowhere left to turn. The breaking point. Marcus sat on his bunk with his back against the wall, knees pulled tight to his chest. The cell felt smaller than ever, as if the walls were inching closer with each breath. His face was swollen, his ribs still bruised, and every part of him throbbed with pain. But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. It was the silence. He had no one to talk to. No one to trust. The other inmates pretended not to see him. The guards mocked him or ignored him. Even his own voice felt trapped inside his head, strangled by fear. At night, he lay awake listening to the sounds of Rikers. The clang of doors, the shuffle of footsteps. Sometimes the muffled cries of another inmate being beaten in the darkness. And always, the silence afterward. It was breaking him. He started talking to himself just to hear a voice. He whispered his own name, whispered his mother's name, just to remind himself that he was still human, that he still existed outside these walls. But Rikers has a way of crushing even that hope. One evening during count, as the inmates stood lined against the wall, Marcus felt a sharp shove from behind. He stumbled forward, catching himself on the concrete. Laughter echoed around him. Before he could turn, a fist exploded against the side of his head. He dropped to the floor as boots rained down on him. Kicks to his back, his stomach, his legs. The blows came fast, furious, from every direction. The guards stood by, watching. Not a word. Not a move to stop it. Marcus curled into a ball, the world spinning, his body screaming with pain. Somewhere in the chaos, he realized he wasn't fighting back. He wasn't even trying. He just lay there, absorbing every strike, his spirit breaking with each hit. And when it was over, when the laughter faded and the boots stepped away, Marcus lay on the cold concrete floor, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he wondered if the silence of Rikers wasn't just about survival. Maybe the silence was how Rikers killed you, slowly, piece by piece, until you no longer had the strength to scream. Losing his grip. Days blurred into nights, nights into days. Marcus no longer knew what time it was. The lights flickered on and off, but it all felt the same, an endless loop of noise, silence, violence, and fear. He stopped eating most meals. The food turned his stomach now, the watery oatmeal, the stale bread, the meat that smelled like rust. He pushed trays away untouched, his body growing weaker. The silence inside him grew louder. Sometimes he swore he heard voices in the stillness. His mother calling his name, a friend from the outside laughing, the sound of sneakers on a city street. For a few seconds, he'd believe it was real, until the cold concrete walls reminded him it was just his mind slipping. One night, he dreamed of freedom. The wind on his face, the hum of traffic, the sun breaking through clouds. But when he opened his eyes, all he saw was steel. All he smelled was sweat and bleach. Rikers wasn't just breaking his body, it was breaking his mind. But the silence wouldn't let him disappear completely. During a routine escort to the showers, 2 inmates surrounded him in the hallway. Marcus didn't even see the first punch coming. It split his eyebrow open, blood dripping into his eye. Another hit slammed him against the wall, the back of his skull bouncing off the concrete. The guards didn't rush in. They didn't shout. They simply watched. The men beat him until his knees buckled, until he slid down the wall, his blood smearing the surface behind him. The corridor echoed with the sound of fists, but when it was over, silence fell again. Marcus sat there, his vision swimming, his body shaking, his mind caught between reality and madness. And in that silence, one thought settled heavy in his chest. Rikers didn't need chains to hold him. The silence itself was the prison. Drowning in the silence. Marcus sat in his cell, staring at the cracks in the concrete as if they might whisper answers. His swollen face was a map of bruises, his ribs ached with every breath, and his blood-stained shirt clung to his skin. But worse than the pain was the emptiness inside him. He didn't know how long he'd been there anymore. Hours felt like days, days like weeks. The silence wrapped around him like a chain, dragging him deeper into hopelessness. When the voices came, he stopped fighting them. He whispered back to them in the dark. He spoke to his mother as if she were sitting on the bunk beside him. He told her he was sorry, told her he wanted to come home. He told her he couldn't survive this place. But the walls never answered. The silence always won. Then one night, everything shifted. The tier erupted with shouts. An argument had exploded between 2 rival crews, and Marcus could hear the tension boiling. He pressed against the bars, watching as fists flew, bodies collided, and guards moved slowly, too slowly, to break it up. Suddenly, an arm reached through the bars beside him. A hand shoved something into his cell, a sharpened shank, wrapped in tape. Marcus froze, staring at the weapon on the floor. His heart pounded as he picked it up, the cold metal shaking in his hand. He hadn't asked for it. But now it was in his possession, and in Rikers, that meant something. Weapons had a purpose. Weapons had an owner. Weapons demanded loyalty. From across the tier, an older inmate locked eyes with him. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. The message was clear: your silence is over. Either you use it or it uses you. Marcus's stomach twisted. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to kill. But he could feel the pull of Rikers tightening around him, dragging him toward a choice that would change everything. And in that moment, standing in the glow of flickering lights with a shank in his hand, Marcus realized the silence wasn't just breaking him anymore. It was shaping him into something he swore he'd never become. The choice. The shank sat heavy in Marcus's hand, though it weighed almost nothing. His pulse pounded in his ears, faster, louder, until it drowned out everything else. Around him, the tier erupted in chaos, men shouting, bodies slamming into bars, guards shouting orders they had no intention of enforcing. Marcus stood frozen in his cell, staring at the weapon as if it might disappear. He didn't want it. He didn't ask for it. But in Rikers, choice was an illusion. Across the tier, the older inmate who had slipped him the shank locked eyes with him again. This time, there was no question, no waiting. He jabbed a finger toward a rival across the row, a man twice Marcus's size, his face twisted with rage. The message was clear: do it. Prove yourself. Marcus's chest tightened. He thought of his mother. He thought of the boy he had been before all this, the one who just wanted a pair of sneakers, who never imagined he'd end up in a place like this. But then he thought of the last time he refused. The beating. The laughter. The guards who looked away. The silence that followed. His legs moved before his mind could stop them. The tier door slid open in the chaos, and Marcus stepped into the madness, weapon clutched tight. The rival inmate turned, eyes narrowing, recognizing what was coming. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. His heart screamed, "Don't do it." But Rikers doesn't care about hearts. The man lunged at him first, fist swinging. Marcus raised his arms, blocking the blows as best he could. The shank pressed against his palm, slick with sweat. He knew he had 1 second to decide: drop it and face certain punishment from both sides, or use it and cross a line he could never uncross. The screams of the fight echoed. Guards stood back, waiting. The silence after this moment would define him forever. And Marcus, shaking, terrified and cornered, raised the weapon. Crossing the line. The world around Marcus slowed. The shouting, the fists, the chaos, it all became a blur. The only thing clear was the man in front of him, bigger, stronger, charging forward with fury in his eyes. Marcus's grip tightened on the shank. His body shook so violently he thought he might drop it, but his survival instinct screamed louder than his fear. The rival slammed into him, fists hammering down. Pain exploded across Marcus's ribs, his vision flashing white. He stumbled back, nearly losing his footing. Then instinct took over. With a desperate cry, Marcus swung. The shank cut through the air, striking flesh. The man howled in rage, staggering back as blood bloomed across his shirt. Gasps rippled through the tier, the fight momentarily frozen in shock. Marcus's chest heaved, his hand trembling as he stared at what he had done. The weapon was slick, his own breath ragged, his mind spinning. He hadn't wanted this. He never wanted this. But in Rikers, one didn't matter. Only survival did. The rival roared again, lunging forward, but before he could strike, the guards finally stormed in. Batons swung, pepper spray filled the air, men hit the ground coughing and screaming. Marcus dropped the shank, his body collapsing to the floor as boots and fists rained down, not just on the rival but on everyone. The chaos ended in seconds. And then came the silence. Marcus lay face down on the concrete, wrists twisted into cuffs, his cheek pressed against the cold floor. His ears rang, his ribs ached, and his heart pounded with the weight of what he had done. He had crossed the line. And he knew there was no going back. The aftermath. The silence after the riot was worse than the fight itself. The tier smelled of pepper spray and blood, and the floor was slick with sweat and pain. Marcus sat shackled, his face pressed against the cold wall, the weight of the shank still heavy in his memory. The guards dragged him out, their hands rough on his arms. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. His fate was already sealed. Thrown into solitary confinement, Marcus sat alone in the box. Just a concrete room, a steel bed, and endless silence. No voices. No footsteps. No sense of time. Just the echo of his own thoughts and the pounding truth of what he had done. He thought about the moment he swung the shank. He thought about the blood. He thought about how quickly the silence of Rikers had turned him into something he swore he'd never become. And as the days stretched on, Marcus realized the brutal reality. Rikers didn't just punish your body, it buried your spirit in silence until you broke. Behind the silence, Rikers Island is more than a jail. It is a machine powered by silence. A silence that hides the bruises, covers the screams, and swallows the truth. A silence enforced not just by inmates, but by the very guards meant to keep order. For Marcus and thousands like him, silence was never protection. It was prison within the prison, a force that turned boys into men too quickly, men into monsters too easily, and monsters into shadows that no one dared to speak about. Behind the silence lies the real story of Rikers, a place where justice is forgotten, humanity is stripped away, and survival means losing pieces of yourself one day at a time. And until that silence is broken, the brutal reality of Rikers will continue to claim lives, not with noise, but with the deafening weight of things left unsaid.